welcome you to Lesson 4 in your Professional Diploma in Wine Appreciation. We have set our foundations in the previous lessons, and the time has come to taste some wine. My name is Julia Blaine, and I will be your educator for this course. In today's lesson, we will discuss the fundamentals of taste. I will show you how to set up a wine tasting at home, and I'll give you some tips on how to develop your palate. Before we get into the ins and outs of setting up a tasting at home, we first need to understand how taste and the role of our senses work. Before getting into the ins and outs of setting up a tasting at home, we first need to understand how we taste and the role that our senses play. Anyone can be a wine taster. We already have all the hardware that we need, so all it takes is some conscious effort. As individuals, we all vary in terms of our genetic makeup, and this includes which smells we are sensitive to. Because of this, it is very unlikely that two people experience the exact same sensations when smelling or tasting a wine. And this explains why there really is no right or wrong when it comes to tasting wine. You might be sensitive to some smells that somebody else is not. The gift of smell is really something that we should not take for granted. There is a small percentage of people called anosmics, and they've got a defective or damaged sense of smell. This can either be from birth or it can happen with old age. Different animals have got different tasting and smelling abilities. Humans have a small part of the brain that is developed to interpret neural messages from the nose. It is in this area that the sense of smell and taste come together and become a joyous experience. Electrical signals are sent to our olfactory bulb once an odor molecule binds to a receptor. The olfactory bulb, which is located at the base of the forebrain, then relays this electrical signal to areas in the brain for processing. The piriform cortex, a collection of neurons, is one of the areas in the brain that works to identify smells. The other area is the thalamus. This is the structure that works as a relay station for all of the sensory information that comes into the brain. It is there that smell information is transmitted into the orbitofrontal cortex, where it is integrated with taste information. Did you know that it's believed that the human sense of smell is the most accurate between the ages of 30 to 60 years, after which these neural messages tend to become a little bit fainter? A key element in tasting wine is developing your olfactory memory. Humans do this throughout their lifetime, mostly unconsciously. It is possible to add to olfactory memory bank by being conscious of all that we smell and reinforcing it with practice. By practicing, one can learn to pick up nuances and layers in wine that we might not have been previously sensitive to. Taste used to be a key sense in survival of humans by indicating which foods were fit for consumption. Sweetness represented foods that had calories and energy, whereas bitter foods were potentially poisonous. Our ancestors actually passed these genes on to us. Today, we rely on our sense of taste more for pleasure and enjoyment than survival. Taste refers to the sensory experience that we have inside the mouth and on the tongue. Aroma occurs in the nose and is directly connected to our sense of smell. When aroma and flavor integrate with each other, this is when we experience flavor. Originally, it was believed that there are four main tastes: sweet, sour, bitter, and salt. The old-fashioned map of the tongue is now believed to be incorrect. Although taste buds are actually spread all over the tongue, and therefore there aren't specialized regions for perceiving certain tastes, some individual taste buds can be more sensitive than others. Did you know it was Aristotle that counted 7 basic tastes? Along with the four mentioned above, he added astringent, pungent, and harsh. Astringent can be described as dry or puckering mouthfeel, whereas pungent can be described as spiciness or hotness, and harsh can be used to describe an intense bitterness or disagreeable tastes. To bring these terms into wine, tannins can be described as astringent, high alcohol can be described as pungent, and a very bitter wine can be described as harsh. Today, it is accepted that there are 5 basic tastes: sweet, salt, bitter, sour, and umami, a term that was first described by a Japanese scientist about a century ago. Umami is described as a savory taste, like that found in soy sauce, aged beef, or cooked mushrooms. Taste begins with the inside molecule with a microscopic taste bud. What you see on your tongue actually aren't taste buds. They are papillae, which contain taste buds. From the taste bud, the stimuli travels to the brain, where it merges with other senses and becomes the experience that can be described as flavor. According to research, only a small part of our experience with food comes from our taste buds. The rest is the result of a sort of backwards smelling. Our perception of flavor is a very complex journey. When we swallow something, the volatile compounds move up behind our palate and into our nasal cavity. Here they bind with odor receptors. Humans have about 350 to 400 of them, and it is here that we perceive flavor. This is called retronasal olfaction and is different to our experience of taste in the taste buds and ordinary smelling, which is known as orthonasal olfaction. When it comes to wine and how it interacts with our mouth, we are looking at 2 main elements: taste and mouthfeel. As previously mentioned, taste refers to sweet, sour, salt, bitter, and umami and is perceived by our taste buds, whereas mouthfeel is a sensation in the mouth or a feeling, like astringent tannins are an example. Flavor is when the taste, mouthfeel, and aroma of a wine all come together. So now we know our tongue can only taste 5 tastes, but our olfactory system can register and process thousands of aromas at a time. So even though it feels like you are tasting mostly in your mouth, it's actually the olfactory system that does most of the work. We now know that the aromatic compounds in wine need to interact with oxygen in order to volatilize and become accessible to the olfactory system. When it comes to smelling wine, smells are put into 2 main categories: the aroma and the bouquet. These terms are not an exact science, but more of a grouping. Let's take a look at aromas. Aromas are derived from the grape cultivar. Aromas in wine consist of primary aromas. As previously stated, these are aromas derived directly from the grape, and it is part of the grape's intrinsic personality. We can divide primary aromas into 3 subcategories: fruit aromas, herbal aromas, and floral aromas. Let's take a look at primary aromas that we could find in Merlot. An example of a fruit aroma is something like black cherry. An example of a herb aroma is mint, and an example of a floral aroma is violet. These are all characteristics that are quite typical in Merlot. The bouquet of a wine is developed during alcoholic fermentation, maturation, and aging of wine. A wine's bouquet is comprised of secondary and tertiary aromas. These aromas are associated with yeasty aromas, spice aromas like cinnamon and vanilla, and nutty aromas. Let's have a look at Merlot again in this example. For yeasty aromas, we could pick up some hints of yogurt or sourdough bread. In spicy aromas, we can find hints of cinnamon, vanilla, and allspice, and with nutty aromas, we might pick up some hazelnut or toasted almond. So we're coming to realize that taste is a multi-sensory experience, and therefore sight plays a role as well. By looking at the wine in our glass, we can get some clues as to what to expect in the wine. Before we taste a wine, we start to gather all sorts of information with our eyes, and that starts to paint a picture of that we will later fill in with other information gained by other senses. When we are looking at a wine, there are many things that can become some visual cues that can be useful. For example, we can look at the tears or the legs on the wine, we can look at the viscosity, and we can evaluate the color. You might have heard people talk about wine legs or tears that form on the edge of the wine glass, like you can see in the picture. So wine legs or tears form a result of the Gibbs-Marangoni effect, which is defined as the mass transferred along an interface between two fluids due to a gradient of surface tension. So what happens when you swirl the wine in your glass is that you are creating a thin film of wine on the surface of the glass. And as alcohol volatilizes and evaporates from the wine, the surface tension gradient is created. And the remaining wine and water mixture will form little droplets that run back into the glass, like a tear-shaped pattern. So, what do these tears actually tell you about wine? Tears give you an indication of two things. Firstly, the alcohol content, and secondly, the viscosity. The more legs you see, generally you can assume the higher alcohol. So the more legs you see, you can assume the alcohol and the content in the wine is higher. Viscosity is defined as the state of being thick, sticky, and semi-fluid in consistency due to internal friction. So sweet wine generally has a high viscosity. So the slower the tears run down the side of the glass, you can assume there's more sugar in the wine. When we are looking at wine and evaluating its color, we can get a lot of information by looking at it. We can look at the relationship between color and pH. Wine with a high pH, which is a low acidity, will have a bluish or purple hue, whereas wine with a low pH, which means it's got a very high acidity, will have more of a ruby or garnet hue. If we look at the relationship between color and age, young wines will display colors that are more purple or ruby, whereas older wines will develop a brick red color. This color change is due to the polymerization and precipitation of anthocyanins and tannins. This precipitation is the sediment that is often found in old wines. Exposure to oxygen causes a chemical reaction in wine called oxidation, which we touched on lightly in the previous lesson. This can result in a dullness in the wine as well as a browning in the color. Grape cultivar can also influence the color, particularly in red wines because the color of the wine comes from interaction with the skin of the grape. Each grape cultivar is unique in terms of berry size and thickness of the skin. Some wines will naturally be lighter than others then. For example, a wine made from Pinot Noir grapes will be lighter than a wine made from Cabernet Sauvignon grapes because the skins of a Pinot Noir. Scrap that. All right. Now that we have an understanding of what role each one of our senses play in the tasting experience, it's time to put them into practice. The 4 steps to the sensory analysis of wine are to look, smell, taste, and conclude. When looking at wine in the glass, tilt the wine over a white or a neutral background. Make sure there is good light in the room that you are in and take a good look. And write down what you notice in terms of color and viscosity. Some keywords that you can use here for, let's say, example, a Pinot Noir is the color. Write down what you notice in terms of color and viscosity. Some keywords that you might use here are light ruby color, clear and bright. Tears indicate medium viscosity and alcohol, and there are no visual flaws. Take a moment to look for flaws, like excessive browning that shouldn't occur in young wine or a cloudy, murky wine. We'll look at these flaws in more detail in a later lesson. So once you've had a good look and you've noted what you see, it's time to smell. Swirl your glass a couple of times in order to introduce oxygen to the wine and liberate the aromas. Tilt the glass toward you and get your nose right up in there and take a big whiff. Try to identify 2 or 3 aromas at first. The idea here is to start broad, and then you can dive into detail if you like, and you can go as far as to group the aromas into primary, secondary, and tertiary. Trying to find the words to describe your sensory experience like aroma can be difficult, but with practice it becomes easier, and as you start to develop your own vocabulary, you'll see it becomes second nature. When smelling a wine, once again, start broad and then try to narrow it down. For example, in a young Pinot Noir. For example, in a young Pinot Noir, the first smell I take of the wine, the first smell I pick up fruit. Then I ask myself, which fruit do I smell? Is it red fruit or black fruit? I take another sniff and I realize it's red fruit. So now I think about which red fruits I know, and I go back for a third smell. Ah yes, there it is, strawberries. You get the idea. You can go deeper and even ask yourself, is it fresh strawberry or is it strawberry compote? These are all part of your olfactory memory bank. By the time it has come to tasting wine, we've already started to paint quite the picture, and in this step, it all comes together. Did you know that some people say keeping your mouth open while you smell wine accentuates the smells? Try this and see if you notice any differences. Right, so we're back to taste. Once again, it is a good idea to introduce oxygen to this process. Swirl your glass again and take a sip. Try to pull some oxygen through your lips into your mouth slowly and allow the wine to cover your entire mouth. This might make a slurping sound, and don't worry, it's not rude. This is common practice. You really want to give your taste buds a good opportunity to register what's going on before you swallow or spit the wine. Try to identify what you are tasting and note 2 to 3 flavors, following a similar process that you did in the aroma identification. Register the taste of the wine as well as the mouthfeel. So when we're tasting, we're looking for the taste, which is what we previously discussed in terms of sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami. We are looking for the texture, which refers to the feeling in the mouth. This is the feeling of tannins, for example, which can be astringent and grippy and dry, or it can be silky, velvety and smooth. And then we're also looking at the length of the wine and the aftertaste. This adds to the complexity of taste. The length refers to how wine can change in one sip, and there are 3 stages. This can be the beginning, the mid, and the finish. Let's look at sweetness as an example. The sweetness in wine refers to the residual sugar, or just RS for short, and it's measured in gram per liter. Typically, a dry wine would have 0 grams per liter sugar, but the human threshold for picking up sweetness of wine is only at 4 grams per liter. Sweetness works in conjunction with acidity, meaning a wine with an RS of 6 grams per liter can taste bone dry because the acidity is really high. An example of this is Coca-Cola, which has an RS of about 100 grams per liter, but it has a pH of 2.52, which is much lower than what you find in wine. The pH of wines normally range between 3 and 4. Tannins in wine can also be bitter, and alcohol in wine can taste bitter, sweet, spicy, or oily. Sweetness can also taste oily. Think about if you've ever had a teaspoon of honey, how that feels in your mouth. It's also possible to pick up salt and umami in a wine, but we'll get into these details later. Now that we have received all of the stimuli, it's time to apply our mind and interpret it. Think about what you have experienced and try to describe it. Like I mentioned, this might be a little bit hard at first, but it gets better the more you practice, just like learning to play a musical instrument. If you approach every wine that you drink from now on with this mindset, it will soon become second nature. All it takes is a few minutes of consideration and observation. Take some time to make a summary of your experience and form your opinion of the wine. When it comes to tasting wine, developing your palate is one great way comes to tasting wine and developing your palate, one great way to practice is by visiting wineries and vineyards and doing formal wine tastings. This is a place where you can discuss wine and ask questions in an environment that is conducive to your palate development. The more you practice, the easier it will become to identify flavors and aromas with confidence. Another way is to host tastings at home with a group of like-minded people where you can freely explore and discuss opinions and conclusions. Forming your own tasting group is a wonderful way to learn about wine, practice your tasting muscles, and expand your olfactory memory bank. Hosting a great wine tasting isn't rocket science. It just requires some thought and consideration. So here are some things to consider when setting up a wine tasting at home. A theme is important because it will set the tone for the tasting and create some structure to the event. It allows you to focus on what is at hand and learn about wine categorically, which makes it easier for the information to sink in. When choosing a theme, consider the level of your guests' wine expertise. Some examples of themes for a wine tasting are region, vintage, and cultivar. For region, an example could be a tasting of Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand versus a Sauvignon Blanc from South Africa. A tasting like this allows you to focus on one cultivar and you can get to know how it performs in different regions. Your regions can either be globally or it can be more locally. Vintage, you can choose to explore a particular vintage of wines from the same region to understand the climatic conditions of that particular year. For example, a wine tasting of red wines in Bordeaux for the year of 2017. Or you can select one producer and do a vertical tasting. A vertical tasting is where you taste the same wine from the same producer over a few years. Example, Merlot from a specific producer from the years 2005 all the way through to 2010. You can also do a tasting to explore one cultivar without any constraints or borders. Example, Pinot Noirs from California, Burgundy, New Zealand, and South Africa. There are endless combinations of themes that you can choose from for your tastings, and you can really get creative. Along with choosing your theme, you also need to decide whether or not the tasting will be blind or sighted. A blind tasting is where the wines are kept secret. The guests don't know what's being poured for them. They might know the theme, but the rest of the details they need to gather by power of deduction by conducting a sensory analysis of the wines. A sighted tasting is where the wines are known beforehand, and it's just a little bit more casual and for enjoyment and discussion. Below is a basic checklist of things that you need in order to pull off a wine tasting at home. If you are hosting a wine tasting for more people than what you have glasses for, rent glasses so that the glasses are identical and that you have enough for each person for every flight of wine. It's important to have water so that you can stay hydrated, and also maybe you want to rinse your glasses out with water in between wines. Print out a wine tasting mat so that guests can keep track of which wine is which. A wine tasting mat also provides a white background that helps you to see the wine color better. A nice touch is to print out a sheet for guests to write down their tasting notes for the evening, and if the tasting is sighted, you can even provide some printouts with information on the theme. Remember to decant any wines in advance if necessary, and keep the serving temperature of different wines in mind. Another tip is to keep the room where you are doing the tasting quite neutral smelling. Avoid things like scented candles, and don't wear strong cologne that can interfere with the experience. A standard tasting pour is about half that of a standard serving. So anything between 75 to 90 milliliters per glass. So you can bank on roughly 10 servings per bottle of wine. I mentioned earlier that wines are served in flights. A flight of wines is how many wines you serve per round of tasting. If you are serving 6 wines in a night, you can serve it either in 2 flights consisting of 3 wines each, or 3 flights consisting of 2 wines each. It's up to you. The reason why we serve in flights is so that there's enough time to taste and analyze the wine properly. The reason why we serve in flights is to allow for enough time to analyze the wine properly. You need to ensure that you have enough glasses for each flight so that you can compare the wines to each other, and make sure you allow for enough time between each flight so that your guests can discuss and take their notes. Remember, wine tastings are an interactive experience. Wines are normally poured in a progression from lighter wines to fuller wines, and here is a list of progressions. Wines in a wine tasting is normally poured from light-bodied to full-bodied and sweet, and here's an example of a classic progression of wines in a wine tasting. Palate fatigue is also known as taste bud exhaustion, and it occurs when tasting a multitude of comparable products consecutively. Many believe that this happens when your nose or taste buds are overstimulated or overworked. Researchers believe that this is actually not the case, and the fatigue occurs in the brain and not on your sensory receptors. When we experience something on a sensorial level, a signal is sent to our brain where it is decoded and interpreted. If we are sending a similar signal to our brain repetitively, for example, if we are sniffing the wine in our glass multiple times, the brain can get confused by these signals and can create false interpretations. You might have noticed when you take your first whiff of a wine, something might stand out immediately, but as you go back and revisit continuously, you might feel lost or like all of the smells have gone. If this happens to you, don't panic. There are a few things you can do. Firstly, take a break from tasting and smelling and give your brain a chance to recoup. Along with this, you can employ a palate cleanser. You'll also find that with more practice, you'll start to develop endurance and learn to trust your initial impulses, which means you won't have to revisit the glass as much as you normally did. Tasting can be mentally taxing, and it really requires a lot of concentration and focus. But remember, practice makes perfect. Here are some tips and tools to help you in developing your palate, increasing your vocabulary, and growing your confidence. Palate cleansers are a really great element to add to your wine tasting, as they help you reset when you're fatigued. When hosting a tasting, it's best to keep things simple. The purpose of a palate cleanser is to neutralize flavors between tasting, so maybe stay away from the blue cheese. Plain white bread or French bread is considered one of the best ways to cleanse your palate because of its plain flavor. The starchiness of the bread helps in absorbing any remaining flavors from the wine you just had. Plain crackers, sometimes aptly called wine crackers, are also great for the same reason. They're plain, they tend to absorb residual flavors, and they don't impart any flavor in your mouth. Eating bread or plain crackers in conjunction with water should do the trick when your palate needs a break. When it comes to the nose, there are two tricks you can try. Have you ever noticed that in perfume stores, they often have bowls of coffee beans? This isn't for consumption, but it's actually used to reset your nose. Coffee beans have a very rich and dense smell, and just one small whiff of coffee beans is enough to shift the receptors in your nose and brain to something completely different, so that when you sniff your next wine, your sense of smell is reset and heightened. If you don't have coffee beans nearby, you can smell the groove in your flexed arm. This is a neutral smelling space. We have learned that you get primary, secondary, and tertiary aromas in wines. To recap, primary aromas come from the grape itself, whereas secondary and tertiary aromas are from the fermentation, maturation, and aging process. In grape juice, most aroma molecules are bound up with sugar so that they cannot be volatile and are thereby unavailable to be sensorially perceived. During fermentation, once the sugar is turned into alcohol, volatile aromatic compounds are volatilized or set free, and we are able to detect them. We are going to have a look at some of these compounds. Terpenes is a common one that's found primarily in grape skins. They account for flavors and aromas of rose petals or citrus, and they are found abundantly in nature in blossoms and fruit. We also get aldehydes. This accounts for the freshly cut grass smell in Sauvignon Blanc. And vanillin is another one. This is a chief flavor of vanilla beans. This compound is also derived from fermenting wine in oak, especially American oak. The green bell pepper in Cabernet Sauvignon is a type of pyrazine called methoxypyrazines. This is a very stable compound that forms part of the varietal characteristic, and some grapes like Cabernet Sauvignon. We've touched on esters in previous lessons. These volatile flavor compounds are created by reactions between alcohols and acid, and they are responsible for many primary fruit flavors found in young wines. Diacetyl is the most obvious diketone, and it smells like melted butter. It can also come across as a creamy mouthfeel in wine, and it is a byproduct of malolactic fermentation, which we will discuss in a later lesson. Volatile sulfur compounds occurring in grapes are known as mercaptans, and they are released during alcoholic fermentation. An example of a mercaptan is the compound that gives Sauvignon Blanc its passion fruit characteristics. By now we know that wine's flavor comes from aroma compounds that are released during alcoholic fermentation. Each wine can contain hundreds of aroma compounds, and each of these can influence the flavor of the wine. The first thing that people often look to identify in wines are fruit flavors. In red wines, there are two main categories of fruit flavors: red fruit and black fruit. Looking to identify fruit when tasting wine is always a good starting point. Some cultivar characteristics are specific to a certain type of fruit. For example, in Pinot Noir, you can expect to find red fruit flavors like cherry and raspberry, whereas in Cabernet Sauvignon, you might find more black fruits like blackcurrant. These are just general umbrella terms, but it's a good starting point when you're still finding your feet. The main categories of fruit that can be found in white wine include citrus, stone fruit, and tropical fruit. Examples of citrus include grapefruit, lime, and lemon. Stone fruit can be apple, peach, or pear, and tropical fruits can be pineapple, passion fruit, and lychee. The expression of these fruit characteristics in white wines is highly dependent on the climate in which the grapes are grown. We have put a lot of focus on developing a sensory memory bank, but with all that being said, it's really tough remembering every single thing that we smell and taste. This is where taking notes come in handy, and here are a few tips in writing meaningful tasting notes for yourself. Try to be specific. Instead of saying the wine is fruity, try to list at least one specific fruit. Separate your descriptions for what you see, smell, and taste. Try to describe the mouthfeel and the texture of the wine using words like dry, tannic, full-bodied, light, or thin. Ask yourself if the wine was balanced or not. Is there anything that stood completely out of place? Try and compare this wine with any other wine that you've had before, and look for something that sets the wine apart and that is unique about the wine. Lastly, try and draw a conclusion and decide to yourself, did you like the wine or not? Lastly, try and draw a conclusion and ask yourself if you like the wine or not, and why. Luckily, our sense of smell and taste are continuously evolving and can be improved. In fact, your taste buds and olfactory receptor cells are some of the fastest growing and rapidly generating cells in the body. By paying attention to smells and tastes around you, you can grow your sensory memory bank every day. One thing you can do is sniff stuff. I mean it. Go to your spice rack and familiarize yourself with smells. Get hold of some fresh herbs and smell and taste them. And next time you eat an apple or a slice of lemon, take time to smell it and really register what you are experiencing. Become observant when you are cooking food and eating it, and try to identify all of the ingredients. And lastly, be adventurous. Try new things, mix it up, and discover new flavors. The more you pay attention to how things in your day-to-day interact with your senses, the easier they will become to identify and interpret. If you reinforce the smell of cloves into your memory bank, for example, the next time you're sniffing the complexities of red wine, you might find the cloves jump out at you like never before. I challenge you to find something around you that resembles the color of your wine and tell us about it, either in words or pictures. #SureWine. Have you ever thought about which career options there are in the wine industry. Over the course of your professional diploma in wine appreciation, we are going to explore all the different avenues that you could potentially pursue. The 5 practical skills that we will develop in this wine appreciation course includes tasting, navigating, viticulture and oenology, wine styles and cultivars, and wines of the world. Congratulations once again on embarking on this journey, and have a look at the skills that you have acquired so far. This is just the tip of the iceberg, as in wine one never stops learning. We will continue to check in with you and your progress over the rest of the course. Keep it up. I really hope you are enjoying this course so far. Cheers, and see you soon for lesson 5.